It's a brand new semester, which for many students means a brand new set of courses that are going to have a billion mandatory readings. You're going to learn a bunch of new knowledge that is sometimes contradictory between those courses, and of course a bunch more graded assignments that are going to test that knowledge you've developed. And if you're in university, then probably also assess your critical thinking. If that sounds overwhelming, then it's probably because you don't already have a system in place that is going to document and manage all of that knowledge so that you can remember it and retrieve it later. Or you might not understand what your instructors expect from you after having learned all of that stuff. Every university syllabus these days seems to have the words critical thinking under learning objectives, but what actually is that? Critical thinking. And how do you do it? And how do you set up your study habits and note-taking techniques in order to achieve it? In this video, I'm going to explain what I think critical thinking means as a university course instructor myself, and I'm going to walk you through a note-taking system that will almost immediately turn you into a sophisticated critical thinker. This video is also sponsored by a sweet alternative learning platform called Skillshare, but more on them later. I am not exactly a student anymore. I'm actually a PhD candidate in theater studies, and I have started seeing education from the flip side as a university course instructor. That's right, I am now that person who writes critical thinking under learning objectives on their syllabus. And I do that because I think that critical thinking is very important. However, I think trying to achieve something called critical thinking as your goal is sort of besides the point. So when your instructor says that to get an A on this assignment, you need to exhibit critical thinking, what do they mean by that? Well, skills that come alongside critical thinking, or what we call critical thinking skills, might be, according to Google, the ability to form how and why questions, the ability to evaluate an argument or determine its relevance, the ability to solve problems or to form your own opinion, etc. But there is a distinct problem with making critical thinking your goal, because it's impossible to determine the relevance of an argument in a vacuum. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say I make an argument, and I say, although Anyone But You is a much looser adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing than Joss Whedon's 2012 adaptation of the play, Anyone But You better communicates Shakespeare's original theme of men's anxiety over women's sexuality for contemporary audiences. Now, there is a lot more that you're going to need in your tool belt other than just critical thinking skills in order to discuss the relevance or the validity of that argument. First of all, you would need to have seen or read Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. You would also need to have seen Joss Whedon's 2012 adaptation of the play and seen Will Gluck's 2023 update to that text. Second of all, you would need to know whether male anxiety over female sexuality was even a theme in the original text. And third of all, you would need to deduce whether that theme was more prevalent in Gluck's 2023 adaptation than in Whedon's 2012 adaptation. To make your own argument about this argument, which is where I think a lot of your professors probably want you to go, you would need even more information that is based on facts or experiences you've had. Do you see where I'm going with this? Although I do think that critical thinking is and should be the goal of a university education, I don't think it's possible to think critically without just knowing a lot of stuff. And if you know a lot of stuff, then thinking critically is going to come a lot more naturally to you and not feel like a skill unto itself. And perhaps that is why learning taxonomies that course instructors use to write their learning objectives are often shaped like triangles, with all of the fact-based knowledge skills at the bottom and the higher level critical thinking at the top, meaning memorization of facts should take up a lot more space in your learning than critical thinking about those facts. This is Bloom's taxonomy of learning, by far the most popular learning taxonomy I've encountered, but my personal favorite learning taxonomy is Sue Young and Robert Wilson's ICE model of learning. In this model, there are only 3 steps to critical thinking, and those 3 steps are ideas, all of the fact-based information, C, connections, putting those facts in conversation with each other, and E, extensions, your own ideas that extend from your points of connection. So whatever your method of note-taking is going to be, it should first and foremost help you identify, document, and remember lots of information. And I think that is probably universal to every subject you might study in school or outside of school, because knowing stuff is the only logical first step towards critical thinking. What about the arts? You might wonder, surely I don't need to document facts in my physical theater or photography class. The arts are subjective courses of study, so other than their histories, maybe, what is there to memorize? Surely our engagement in the arts should be feelings-based, not facts-based. To which I would respond, the fact that you felt a particular emotion at a particular point in an artistic experience is a fact and can be documented. And it should be documented if you want to remember that particular emotion you felt at that particular moment later when you're writing an essay about that experience. So of course you need to know an art form's history, theory, and techniques in order to study it, but you also need to know its culture, which comes from participating in and experiencing the art. You also need to know how people are responding to the art, which you learn from witnessing others or feeling your own feelings. What's more, memorization is not just something we do in our heads, it's also something we do in our bodies. Individual movements are pieces of embodied information that can be connected together to form dance. So yes, I think regardless of your field of study, the identification, documentation, and memorization of lots of facts is the number one thing that your note-taking system needs to aid in. However, it should also allow you to form connections between bits of information and then expand upon those connections to form your own opinions and ideas. In my undergrad, my bachelor's degree, my form of taking notes was just highlighting important parts of a text or copying down what my lecturer was saying verbatim. Unfortunately, that meant that writing essays or taking exams was always a struggle and always very stressful. It also means that now, as I am developing my own syllabi, I don't remember any of the things that I learned back then, and I can't access my notes about it because it would mean sifting through tons of texts and tons of journals where I've written and highlighted my notes. What's more, because I never put those thoughts into my own words, I never truly learned them. It never truly became knowledge for me. I knew it for a very brief amount of time so that I could write a test or write an essay, but it hasn't stuck with me. And I really regret not learning that stuff more deeply at the time and not storing it and documenting it so that I can now retrieve it, a decade later. Now, as a PhD student and course instructor, I know better. I now have a system that lets me learn and engage in critical discussion without even trying, so I am going to outline that method for you today, which is what I would have done if I knew then what I know now. But first, let me tell you about another way to develop your learning and productivity skills, which is by logging on to the learning platform Skillshare. The sponsor of this video, Skillshare, has collected the teaching of experts in all areas of productivity into distinct learning paths. These learning paths are hand-picked classes meant to be taken in order that build on one another, reinforcing lessons. If you're looking to level up your study techniques, I recommend the Skillshare learning path called Transform Your Study Habits. It features videos from expert learners and YouTubers Mike Boyd, Mike and Maddie, and Ali Abdal. In particular, Mike and Maddie's video, 7 Days to Better Grades, draws from neuroscience to explain how our brain actually learns, then uses that to develop a 7-day plan for effective study. They teach techniques like T-trees and mind mapping that they used while in medical school. Their course builds nicely upon this video by discussing the importance of memorization and connection within the STEM space as opposed to the art space. Although as an art scholar myself, I still found their techniques really powerful. To get started on Skillshare, click the link in my description box below for a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, but act fast because that's only available for the first 500 people to click and only for a limited time. The new year is the perfect time to join the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry pros across film, illustration, design, freelance productivity, and more. Now, back to the video. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring my channel, and welcome to my desk. This is where the magic happens, and by magic, I mean learning. As a reminder, we're looking for a note-taking system that will help us identify information, document that information, and then store that information so it's accessible to us later. Also, the information needs to be somewhat movable and malleable so that we can connect across pieces of information and then ultimately develop new information, which is our ideas, which is our critical thinking about that documented information. Now let's take a look at the system I'm going to recommend to you so that all of that makes sense. This system is called a zettelkasten, which from German translates to slip box, and it's called that because originally It was done on little slips of paper, and those papers were stored in a box. And the idea is that for every reading you do or every lecture you listen to, you should take notes, and those notes should be single pieces of information, so small and irreducible that they can fit on the front of a note card. Each distinct note in this system represents a single idea that can be moved around and positioned alongside other ideas to form connections and visualize potentially new connections, which is the foundation of new knowledge. I don't, however, recommend doing this on paper anymore. Instead, I recommend using a computer. I personally store mine in a software called Obsidian, which I'll be showing you today, but there are other software out there if that makes more sense for you. But my personal favorite is still Obsidian, and it is free, so we're going to start by downloading Obsidian. Obsidian stores all of your notes as markdown files on your computer, so just basic text files essentially, and those files are in a folder. So Obsidian is going to ask you when you want to open a new vault, which is what it calls where it stores all of your notes, which folder you would like to designate for the files or notes that you're going to be storing. Personally, I just store all of mine in my documents folder on my computer in a separate folder called Morgan Obsidian. But for today's purposes, let's call our vault my class notes. So now we have a fresh vault or folder where we're going to store all of our notes, but how should we organize our classes within this folder? In a typical zettelkasten, you don't organize your notes at all. Instead, they organize themselves organically based on the connections that are forming between your ideas. The more connections that have formed, the more likely it is you're going to find a note again. However, in school, you do need some kind of higher level organization for your notes because you don't want to end up writing about Romeo and Juliet on your early modern English literature class exam when actually you studied Romeo and Juliet in your Shakespearean acting class. So we need some level of organization to keep what we learned in each class straight. However, university courses are ultimately arbitrary divisions between knowledge, so our system needs to be flexible enough that we can eliminate it once we're finished those courses, and all of the stuff we learned is just floating in our overarching pool of knowledge alongside everything else we've ever learned, so that things end up organized more authentically rather than being divided arbitrarily into different classes. It might seem at first glance that you should just open a different vault for each of your courses, but please do not do this. Keep all of your knowledge, all of it, in a single vault, no matter where that knowledge came from. Notes housed in separate vaults cannot communicate with each other. Instead, we're going to create separate folders within the same vault because notes in each subfolder can communicate with each other and can grow connections between each other. So in Obsidian, what I would do if I was starting my school term is create a different folder for each class that I'm taking. And inside of each class folder, I'm going to have two different types of notes. The first being literature notes, or source notes as I call them, and these are notes that each note is dedicated to a different reading that you're going to do in the class, or viewing you're going to do, or lecture that you had to attend. And the literature or source notes is where you're just going to dump all of the information that you learned or thought of while reading that source or viewing that source. The second type of notes are permanent notes, and this is basically everything else. It's all of the information you learned. It's all of the thoughts that you had, and they're called permanent notes because they are distinct pieces of information that are relatively unchanging. How you're going to populate your permanent notes will likely be from stuff you dumped into your source notes. So you start by dumping info into your source notes, and then you slowly create permanent notes based on your learning. To keep these types of notes separate, I personally recommend just building a subfolder into each course that is called the name of the course and then literature notes or sources. Once you've got that subfolder for all of your readings and lectures and everything else you refer to over the course of a course, you're going to make a separate note for each reading that is mandatory in your course. Personally, when titling these notes, I like to name them after the author's name, the publication date, and the title of the thing. So for instance, if you watched one of my lectures and you wanted to include that as a source in the course, then you might call it Morgan, January 10th, 2024, Lecture 1. I use dashes in between all of my note names for reasons that I explain in another video, but it doesn't matter for now. So here are all of the sources filled out in my source folder for the course that I happen to be teaching this term, but for our purposes, I'm just calling class 100. And notably, every time you read or watch or hear something or refer to anything for this course, you are going to create a source file for it, even if it's not in the syllabus. This is, first of all, just to make sure that you can find things again later, but second of all, it is to avoid plagiarism when you wow your instructors by including all of this external research on your final essay. So if you referred to a Wikipedia article when researching one of the plays that you studied this term, if you learned something from that article that then became thoughts you had and you might document in your Obsidian, that Wikipedia article should have a note in your sources folder. Now, for all of the mandatory readings that you're going to do in this class, you're going to be filling out all of your notes and quotes and everything else in those source notes. And I also recommend writing the words, "This text was read for the class," and then linking to a note for the class itself. The way that you create a new note and link to it within a note is by putting double square brackets and then the name of the note you want to link or create. So for instance, in my case, I'm going to write, I had to read this text for double square brackets, class 100. And then in every mandatory reading for the class, you're going to put those words. Now to create the note, I actually click the word class 100, and when I open it up, even though I haven't written anything in this note yet, you'll see that it has a lot of backlinks to all of the notes that I had to read for this course. Backlinks are the power of this note-taking system and how you are going to navigate through it later on. Now, a decade from now, when I want to refer to a play, but I cannot remember which play it is. All I know is I studied it during class 100. I can just go to my note for class 100 and look at all the backlinks of the plays that I studied. Or if in the future I've gotten really into Samuel Beckett and I want to discuss the first time I encountered him, which was when reading the play, but I don't remember when that was, I'll just go into my note for play and see, oh, I had to study it for class 100. If you don't set up connection points like this in your notes, then you may never find these plays again, or you may never remember where you learned about them again. Let me give you an example of dumping some thoughts about a literature note. Here is a source that I referred to when preparing to teach this class, which is Mark Rober's TEDx talk. This is a YouTube video, so for now, I just copy and pasted verbatim quotes from the YouTube transcript that I thought were particularly relevant, and I've just dumped them in here. But to make these quotes valuable, I'm going to have to turn them into those bite-sized notes that are written in my own words and are movable pieces of information. So I'm going to break up these quotes into distinct facts that I can refer to again. For example, in this video, Mark Rober refers to what he calls the Super Mario effect, so I'm going to create a note that is just dedicated to explaining Mark Rober's Super Mario effect. I click on that note and it gets created. I am first going to say in his video and link to the source note for the video, and then I'll say Mark Rober says, and actually put the quote. After that, I typically like to say in other words or in my own words, and then put what I thought of that quote, or just describe the idea using my own words. And as I'm taking this note, it makes me think of another piece of information that I gleaned from the video, but is distinct from the current idea. So I'm gonna write double square brackets again, and the name of my new note, specifically the idea that learning is restricted if failure is regarded in a negative light. And then I do the same thing over again. I link the source note, I write in my own words, and I use quotes if necessary. Now, if I open up my Mark Rober TEDx source note graph, you can see that I pulled 3 important pieces of information from the video, and those pieces of information are connected to each other in some ways. And the TEDx talk is also linked to class 100. But it's not just direct quotes where you're going to find information when studying for a class. You are also going to find information from your own experiences and emotions. Those things are also valid sources that hold facts of their own. So take this example from my literature note on Les Belles Sœurs by Michel Tremblay. Spoiler alert, I first write a summary of the play. You might also want to document some of the quotes that stood out to you when reading or viewing this play. Then I wrote down my personal thoughts, almost like I was just journaling about my experience of reading and the emotions that came up. And one of the things I noted is that when I was watching this play at Stratford in 2023, I felt uneasy at the end because things were left unresolved in the narrative. That feeling of unease is important. Your own response to a play or any reading is a very real part of that play. And that feeling you had while doing the reading is going to inform your interpretation of the reading. So I make a note specifically about that feeling, and I call it "The lack of resolution in Les Belles Sœurs left me in a state of unease." In that note, I cite the play itself, of course, and I could also cite the specific production of the play that I saw as its own source note, and then I document the feeling that I had. And then I'm going to read through that and see if it reminds me of any other notes I've already created or new notes that I want to create. And in this case, I remember a note that I took on Les Belles Sœurs about how it resists Aristotelian plot devices, and I think maybe that is what contributed to my unease, because I'm so used to Aristotelian narratives. So I link that note. I also remember a note that I took about the fact that this play responds to the period known as the Great Darkness in Quebec. So I link that one too. Now, if I enter into that note, my Great Darkness note, then right at the top, you'll see where I learned that piece of information, which was from the program for Stratford Festival's production of Les Belles Sœurs. And this is a source that was not on my syllabus, but which I referred to in order to get a deeper understanding of the text that was on my syllabus. So I included this as a source note as well. And so on and so forth. Once you have a bunch of notes in your system, connections are going to reveal themselves to you. And this will not be because you have specifically trained your critical thinking skills. Quite the opposite, actually. It will be because you have identified, documented, and remembered just a whole bunch of information. And you've done it in a way that has let you access it all at once. In other words, you've just done the lower order thinking skills really, really effectively so that the higher order thinking skills are almost inevitable. A few more thoughts before I let you go though. First, remember to check out Skillshare for free at the link in my description box below for more productivity and learning hacks. Second, when taking notes in Obsidian, remember to store them in the correct folder so that you can access all of your distinct course notes. But when the class is over, remember to just get rid of those folders and stick your permanent notes with all the other permanent notes in your vault and your source notes with all the other source notes in a separate folder in your vault. And third, when building connections between notes, do not limit those connections to just notes within a specific course. You should be building these connections between courses and between your courses and your other world experiences. If you go see the movie Anyone But You, which you should because it's excellent, then ask yourself how it is relevant to your early modern English literature class or your Shakespearean acting class. There is no source that is inherently better or more academic than any other. Anyone But You is just as valid a source to learn from as Much Ado About Nothing. The importance and strength of these sources will come from how many connections you develop from them, not from societal expectations about what classifies as good or academic knowledge. I hope this video was helpful. I have a bunch of other videos on Obsidian and zettelkasten if you want to dive deeper into those things. If this video was helpful to you, then please consider sharing it with a friend that might find it helpful. Thank you to Skillshare for making this video possible, and guys, please do me a favor and click that link in the description box below if you want to try out this excellent learning platform that they've created and support my channel even further. The first 500 people to click the link will get a month of Skillshare absolutely free. If you have ideas for future videos, I am always open to suggestions, and with that, happy studying, everybody! See you in another video again soon.